each of us, as it relates to diet, need to start making some changes. Some of them may feel a little bit drastic because the diet that people have become accustomed to is one that is so many standard deviations away from just a baseline, normal, healthy, whole food based diet that starting to make some of these changes is essential.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome back. Let's get right into it, talking about mental health, mental fitness. And this is just going to be a really, really fun time together, thinking about brain metabolism, which is really this wonderful phrase. We have Austin Perlmutter with us, really a storied name in brain health, but also just a wonderful friend and kind of fellow traveler thinking about what's new, what's innovative, what can we understand about the new science of brain health and mental health. So quickly, let me introduce Dr. Austin Perlmutter. He is a board-certified internal medicine physician. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's a published researcher, and he's an international educator about all things brain health. His mission is really help people improve their health by targeting the biological basis of stuckness in our brains and our bodies. His writings, his presentations, and his podcasts and online education programs explore how environmental factors influence our cognitive and mental state and have reached millions of people. Dr. Perlmutter has been featured on PBS, Rolling Stone, MedPage Today, Newsweek, Medical News Today, NPR, and a wide range of media outlets. He's the co-producer of the Alzheimer's, the Science of Prevention series, which is just a really wonderful series all about Alzheimer's prevention, really interviewing a lot of the top experts, getting into the details of, I just saw a recent study, I think it was a 53% reduction in Alzheimer's disease risk with people adhering to the MIND diet. So it gets into that science. This also came out several years before that study. So it's a really just wonderful series. And then the host of the Better Brain Blueprint series, which I was really thrilled to be a part of and to get interviewed for. So that is just another big recommendation. He is currently the managing director at Big Bold Health, which is a food as medicine company focused on helping people rejuvenate health through better immune function, and where he's published a pioneering study that we're going to be talking about, exploring the effects of plant nutrients on human aging and epigenetics. Dr. Austin Perlmutter, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
I just want to hop right into it. This phrase, brain metabolism. I love that you use that because all everybody talks about is ketogenic diets, which are really interesting and cool, but underneath that is brain metabolism. Austin, can you tell us first what that means to you, and then I want to get into how you got interested in this stuff.
Right. Well, just quick background here. When people talk about the brain, they tend to focus on just a couple aspects of brain function. And we've more recently seen that people start to make connections between something like a drug that changes the way we feel about, let's say, food. GLP-1 agonists are popular, but they haven't necessarily made this connection between energetics and brain function. And this is absolutely vital, essential, so important to understanding how our brains work, because it is an absolute fact that in order for our brains to function at any level, let alone at a high level, they need a ton of energy. Even though your brain only represents around 2 to 3% of your body by weight, it uses up between 20 and 25% of your body's energy. So anything that goes wrong in terms of getting that energy to the brain and giving the brain consistent access to that energy is a massive liability in terms of how our brains function. So this is the idea of brain metabolism. It is the question of how our brains get access to energy, how they use that energy, and maybe most importantly, what are the outcomes that are associated with issues in that access to consistent energy? And what can we do each day to ensure that our brains are getting the fuel that they need so that we can think, act, and feel our best?
Austin, what do thank you for that. What is the brain doing with all that energy? Like, why does it need so much?
Yeah, hopefully it's doing good things with all that energy.
Like love? I'm sorry, 20% of all the energy of everything I eat for human love and prosperity. That seems like a deal. But it's a lot of energy for a very small organ. Why are neurons such hungry cells?
Yeah. Well, if you think about what's happening in your brain, and I don't mean your in terms of yours, Drew, but anybody's brain, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, 160 or so billion cells, of which half of those cells are neurons. Those are the kind of principal core cells of the brain that get all the press, all the PR. And the other 80 or so billion cells are called glial cells. And we'll come back to this because it's a really, really important and underexplored aspect of what it means to have good brain health is to have good glial cell health. But the principal cells that are using up the majority of the energy within your brain are going to be your neurons. It's important to note that neurons are just stockpiled with mitochondria, these power plants of our cells. And by some estimates, there can be as many as 2 million mitochondria in a single neuron. So I'm not great at math here, but 2 million times 80 billion is a very, very large number. So again, lots of opportunities here for things to go wrong or for things to go right. Neurons are using up somewhere between 70 and 80% of the energy in our brains. The rest is going to these glial cells. And what neurons are doing with all this energy is they're using it to reset after they depolarize. The way that data is transmitted from one neuron to another neuron is that it gets shot across the synapse, which is the space in between neurons, and it leads to a depolarization of that neuron. And
What
so
was
to
I don't think what depolarization.
yeah, we're
What
talking about here is electrical gradients and chemical gradients, and so
like a when the
transmission.
electrical current runs down the little like transmitter, the axon, that's depolarization. So it's like
Right.
a neuron communicating, like shouting its song, singing to the other neuron, but that's the depolarization. And then there's this reset that happens.
Exactly. It has to reset. Literally, what we're talking about here is using up energy and going negative after we transmit data from one neuron to another neuron and needing to replace that polarization gradient. I know we're using some words here, but to replace and put that polarization gradient back into place so that the neuron can transmit another signal. And this takes energy. In addition to this repolarization, we need energy to transport things along the neuron. So data has to go along the neuron, but also other things, for example, the building blocks of neurons, what it needs to repair itself. All this
Hmm.
has to go along the neuron and it needs to create neurotransmitters. We know neurotransmitters, even though, in my opinion, they've been a little bit overblown in terms of saying this is the sole cause of a single issue. We've seen that in the case of serotonin.
That's a really good way to put it. I've really, I think in trying to help people reduce stigma and understand, like, man, the neurochemistry and the new science of the brain is really incredible. That then has gotten overly interpreted. It's like all about serotonin or it's all about dopamine, which, like, they're great, they're wonderful things to be able to use clinically when you need to, but there's so much more going on up there. I love the portrait you're painting, and I hope everybody, as you're thinking about this, kind of seeing this big. I kind of see a tube. We're talking about all this energy, like things getting pumped in and out. And I love how Austin's like, yeah, it's not just that, right? Also, that tube is like a highway sending out the building blocks and all the things needed for maintenance and all the energy needed for this, distant part of the axon way down there. So uh, it's just a wonderful way for us to think in a more nuanced and detailed way about what's going on up there.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I liken it to if you ask a person at a cocktail party, who are you? They might tell you about their job, and their job might be important, but that's not the entirety of what the person does, and maybe isn't even the most important part. And certainly, if you're in a relationship with this person, you don't want them to be all about their job. So the brain has a lot of different jobs. The neurons have a lot of different jobs, and there are a lot of different players in this larger play of how our brains function. And so neurotransmitters are an important part of this play, but just as we started this conversation with saying there's more nuance involved in how our brains work, this neurometabolism, the idea of how our brains process energy, how they use energy, it expands the universe of understanding where things go wrong and how they can go more right in our brains by connecting this very kind of objectively, arguably the most objectively easy thing to understand about the brain, which is that it's an organ, it needs energy, it needs a lot of energy with conditions. And that's where it gets really, really interesting. Because what we're starting to understand now is that brain energetics change across the lifespan, change moment to moment, and that certain things that we do in our day to day life can dramatically impact the health of our brain metabolism. So that's where the rubber hits the road. And the example that most people are familiar with here, just to give a specific one, we don't have to call out a brand, but you've probably seen an ad on TV for a certain type of candy bar, uh, something along the lines of "You're not you when you're hungry." And from this comes this idea of being hangry, right? Where you're feeling off, you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling maybe anxious because you're hungry. And that is really your brain being responsive to metabolic data. It is data from the periphery, from outside of your brain, being conveyed to the brain's metabolic sensors, telling your brain, hi, we need to do something about this. Now, it's not exactly the case that hangry exists the way people like it to be. And it's certainly not the case that every time you're feeling a little bit stressed or anxious, you should reach for that chocolate bar. That is not good advice.
Yeah, no, I had it yesterday where it's not hangry, but I appreciate where that comes from. Sometimes I'll really get into work, as I'm sure you do, and besides my coffee, I'll be in a reasonably fasted state, and it happened in the middle. I just got that pang of like, oh, the alarms went off, or as I hadn't eaten lunch, and I'm sure I could have interacted with someone in a alarming or angryish way, and but I don't know, somehow knowing what it is and being really clear about it, I kind of got back into the work, got it finished up, went and got a snack. But yeah, the idea that relating more of how we're feeling to how our brain is metabolizing energy, how much energy we have. I thought the example maybe you're going to give is when we fall asleep in class, or if you have one of those attacks where you eat something, whatever it is, fast food, a candy bar,
Mhm.
and the shades go down. And you just can fight. You can fight it. You can fight it, and nothing will prevent you from really nodding off. And then if you sleep for just a little bit, sometimes 60 seconds, sometimes a few minutes, I'm talking about falling class and asleep in class specifically, you're wide awake. Like there was some kind of energetic thing that had to happen or some loss of energy. And I'd not really thought about that before in terms of brain metabolism until all this, kind of brain energy, brain metabolism, uh, ideation came into mental health maybe over the past decade. It's been super cool.
Yeah, it changes the calculus dramatically. But what I would say is for anybody who's listening, who's watching, who hasn't really heard about this before, hasn't really thought about this before, that the curiosity and saying, well, our brains actually change moment to moment. If we've got 80 plus billion neurons and all these other cells, and all of them have to have access to fuel sources, and that fuel is variable in terms of the form of fuel and how much we're getting access to. That's just one element of this. We also know that, as we said, neurotransmitters play a role, the neuroimmune system plays a role, neuroplasticity plays a role. The basic point I want to make here, though, is that how we experience life, the way we act, the way we think, the way we feel, is a direct outcome of what is happening within our brains. And so if we start to say, well, I'm feeling a little bit this, that, or the other, we can then tether that to something that creates curiosity and empathy. This is such an important point because in the absence of having a little bit of curiosity around what is happening in our brains, we default to these consolidated views of people's actions being a singular reflection of something like willpower or character, as opposed to being curious about what is happening in their brains and in our brains. So if we're feeling anxious, we might ask ourselves, well, could that be related to neuroimmunity, neurometabolism, to neurotransmitter changes, as opposed to simply saying, oh, well, this is what it is, and there's nothing that can be done. So, this isn't to say it's a panacea by just basically getting curious, you solve issues, but it is to say that the science has told us this is concrete data that basically our brain state changes moment to moment based on these systems. And the most important part of this whole conversation is now the science is telling us, well, here's what you can do to modulate this in a way that benefits you so that you're not just kind of constantly the victim of these changes that unfortunately, by and large, if you're existing in the modern world, the default options here are going to be those that are not so good for us because what we know is that most people, and by most people I mean over 80% of people based on recent data, have at least one attribute of metabolic dysfunction in their bodies. So metabolic dysfunction is a rampant issue in the United States and around the world. We've kind of looked at that as separate from brain health. We've said, oh, metabolic dysfunction, well, that's high blood pressure, that's weight gain, that's diabetes. However, that directly relates to what happens in the brain because the brain, unlike other parts of the body, is not able to hang on to large amounts of energy. We just don't have the storage space within our brains. What that represents then is a direct conduit by which systemic metabolism, meaning the metabolism outside of our brain, can influence brain metabolism. And the last thing I'll say on this is something that doctors learn very quickly when they're in the hospital, especially when we're overnight and things are going wrong, is that if somebody's blood sugar goes way up or way down, there are changes in their brain function. Hypoglycemia, which is a low blood sugar, can be catastrophic to brain health. Specifically, people can become rapidly altered and can suffer lasting brain issues because blood sugar goes too low. Similarly, when blood sugar goes too high, people become quite out of it as a reflection of alterations in brain metabolism. So we get this data very early on showing us that metabolism in the body is linked to metabolism in the brain. But over time, I think we've lost the plot a little bit there, which is to ask the question of, well, at the extremes of metabolic dysfunction, the brain obviously suffers. What happens in the in between stages? And what can we do to enhance metabolism in the body so that brain metabolism also benefits and we have better outcomes as it relates to brain states like mental health and cognitive issues?
Yeah, brain cells, like mostly most people are mostly eating glucose, and part of brain metabolism, also understanding, brain cells also can eat ketones. This is sort of a geeky, nerdy question, but are there studies or kind of research looking at what happens when you feed people ketones?
Yeah, well, just generally speaking, what we know is that the brain's primary fuel source is going to be blood derived glucose. And what I mean there is your blood sugar becomes the fuel for your brain under normal conditions. Now, with that said, we've seen a lot of emphasis recently on conditions like ketosis. Ketosis is a state in which blood ketones go up. And importantly, the brain can use certain ketone bodies, specifically beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, as fuels, as well as lactate, which is kind of a separate conversation, but also interesting. So the question is, how much can we actually use? And also, what happens when we take exogenous ketones? There is data suggesting that the brain will preferentially use ketone bodies if they are available instead of glucose. What we don't have in terms of data right now is to say that we should be taking exogenous ketones as a way to improve brain health outcomes. There are some preliminary studies suggesting this. I do want to say, because this is a very important consideration, how do we go into ketosis, or what are the states in which ketone bodies would be used as our fuel? So, when we're very early in our lives, the brain uses more ketones. When we're fasting for long
Yeah,
periods of
meaning
time,
that, like, if you have a primary diet of breast milk, let's say, and a lot of growth, I notice this in our kids. I'd like put them to bed, and I could smell during growth spurts. I can smell the ketones,
there you go.
and I'm sorry, in the middle of the night when I wake them up, like they've been growing so much overnight. I think that's what it is, where there are these periods where there's just more ketone generation because the body runs out of glucose.
Yeah, there are a number of kind of metabolic changes that happen in the early years. Another interesting one is brown fat reserves tend to be much higher when we're younger, which has a beneficial metabolic effect that we kind of
Well,
lose.
what's the difference? I think everybody listening, we hear that, we sometimes, what's the difference between brown fat and white fat?
Yeah. So just a quick tangent here, but related to the
Quick
general
tangent. Sorry,
metabolic.
everybody, but
Yeah.
everybody's listening. They're like, brown fat, white fat. Which one's which? Yeah.
Well, it directly relates to systemic metabolism. And again, metabolism, to expand it beyond what happens in the brain, is how our body is able to use fuel, break down fuel, and how it processes the whole process between getting the fuel in the body and using it up, creating waste, and so on. But within the body, outside of the brain, our primary fuel reservoir is our fat. And as we know, in many people, we may have over 50%, 60%, sometimes even higher, 80% of our body mass actually comprised of adipose tissue. Now, as we look at what that adipose tissue represents, one of the common myths here, and again, where nuance is needed, is this idea that any fat is bad. And that's absolutely not the case. It turns out that we all kind of benefit from having some fat. So somebody saying I'm, 2% body fat, that doesn't mean that person is a healthy person. There are a number of things that can go wrong when we're at a very low body fat. But specific to what you had just alluded to, there are subtypes of body fat. And so the most common form of fat that most adults have tons of is going to be adipose tissue that is called white adipose tissue or white fat. There are two other types of fat that are worthy of our knowledge. One is brown fat. Brown fat is kind of clustered around the upper torso and along the spine, and it's more so found in children. We lose as a relative percentage of our body fat, that brown fat, as we get older. What makes that brown fat so interesting is that it is involved actually in using up energy. Non shivering thermogenesis is kind of the key term because it has something called uncoupling protein that allows it to basically generate energy, use up fuel. So it's thought that this brown fat is actually of major metabolic benefit to us. Whereas white fat, specifically white fat that is found around the belly and around our viscera, which is called visceral white fat, can be pro inflammatory, can damage our metabolic health, and is the type of fat that has been correlated with conditions like dementia and depression, as well as a host of other diseases. There's one fat that is an in betweener, which is called beige fat. So it makes sense. You have white, you have brown, beige is in between. And what's really interesting here is that beige fat has a lot of the characteristics of brown fat, but we can interconvert, meaning we can change out white fat into beige fat. We can talk a little bit about this research. It's the kind of thing that people talk about around cold plunging and other hormetic stressors, things that stress our body a little bit. But the idea here being that beige fat is beneficial to us, white fat in large quantities, and especially when it's visceral fat around our organs, is not so good for us. And brown fat is good for us, but we can't really create more of it when we're older. So the goal is more beige fat.
Hmm. We'll talk more about that. So, especially because it sounds like there are maybe some things we can do, but it's great just to think in detail about fat and not being a bad word, that not just being related to the fat in our food, but thinking about our metabolism and really us as an organism. It's very dependent on fat and fat metabolism and energy metabolism, especially when it comes to brain health. Um, Austin, I want to talk about how this translates to things like what we eat or actionable steps in our lifestyle that you think really matter in terms of our brain health.
Yeah. Well, I tend to be a little bit anti sensationalism when it comes to dietary interventions, when it comes to lifestyle interventions for brain health. But before I get to that, I do want to just comment on a little bit of the ketogenic diet because that's where a lot of people have focused their energies and interest in terms of understanding interventions to enhance brain metabolic function. And I'll just start by saying my perspective on this is that for a person who is metabolically healthy, I'm unsure that a ketogenic diet is actually a good plan, especially a long term plan for any of the major metrics that I look for in terms of promoting good brain health, good mental health, good cognitive health, and just general balance of how the body works. The reasons for this we can get into, but a ketogenic diet is a form of a restrictive diet, which in general I'm opposed to in terms of generalizing, because restrictive diets, by their very nature, are restrictive, can limit access to certain nutrients, may come with side effects, and can put people on the cycle of dieting, kind of doing a diet, gaining the weight back, and then going back on the diet, which has been shown time and time again to be a poor plan for long term health. But where I think there is really some considerable value in understanding the ketogenic diet is in people with pre existing metabolic dysfunction. Now, the caveat to my saying that this isn't a generalizable issue is that most people have some degree of metabolic dysfunction. And so there's a lot that could be discussed in terms of macronutrient availability and whether certain people benefit from restriction of specifically rapidly digestible carbohydrates that we could talk about. What we do know, though, is that coming back to the brain, When glucose is low in the body, up to 60% of the brain's glucose supply, basically equivalency, can be met through ketones. And we know that beta hydroxybutyrate is more efficient in producing energy than is glucose. How do these ketones work? It may be through mitochondrial benefit. And when we see what we know to date around humans, um, we have some small studies demonstrating a potential benefit in humans in cognition in people with a ketogenic diet. There are a couple of studies. Again, there's one from 2012 that looked at 23 people that showed that after 6 weeks, there was a slight improvement in one aspect of, I think, verbal function in cognitive testing after, again, this 6 week period. And then there was a more recent study of 27 people with mild cognitive impairment where they looked at people who did kind of a keto style diet. They showed that those who had higher levels of urine ketones, which is a measurement for efficacy of the diet, had improvements in cognition and energy. And then I'd say the most there's one additional trial that looked at people with Alzheimer's disease, showing that people who did a ketogenic diet had one improvement in kind of a function of life, not necessarily a cognitive test, but functional status test. But that's to date kind of the most compelling research specific to the ketogenic diet. I will just flag here potential issues: electrolyte deficiencies, constipation, gallbladder issues, menstrual irregularities. Again, it is a restrictive diet. I don't know if you want to weigh in on this. I know you have a lot of expertise around nutritional interventions for brain health.
Just to add into the evidence would be the Shabani Sethi led trial. A number of organizations, number of institutions, I think Michigan, Ohio State, multi-center trial, single arm, looking at a ketogenic diet for people with severe mental illness. Only 23 patients. That's small n, as you've noted, 19 patients with bipolar disorder, if I recall, 5 with schizophrenia, and and they got a lot of what we'd want, a lot, sort of monitoring for all the things that Dr. Perlmutter is talking about, making sure electrolytes are on. There's a significant concern around raising things like LDL, which in the wellness world, I think there's maybe more controversy than there should be, given the recent expansion and kind of data and understanding and just clarity of like, it looks like low LDL is really good, and but sometimes even that gets debated. But anyway, the Shabani Sethi trial, I call it that because she's the primary author and heading the metabolic psychiatry division over at Stanford, was really great in showing that people had a real improvement in metabolic health and markers of metabolic dysfunction or metabolic syndrome, as well as they had great improvements in their measures of their mental health and psychiatric health. And that is great because it shows it can be done. It's a single arm trial. So, people are going to, want a larger, more randomized trial. My understanding there is 5 or 6 other randomized trials that have been funded by the Bazooki Foundation looking at ketogenic diets. So the cool thing is, Austin, when we talk about this in years to come, we're going to have a bunch of trials to be talking about and thinking about. But I really appreciate your clarity. I would agree, and I'm in a similar camp, that I think ketogenic diets for selected individuals, for example, if you have a strong history of bipolar disorder in your family, you have metabolic dysfunction, you're plugged into a great primary care doctor and like a nutritionist or really qualified coach, let's say, to help you with a ketogenic diet, and you're monitoring it well, I think that's a really interesting and reasonable idea.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I love the way you put it. For the general population, just, hey, you're trying to lose a few pounds, or you want to have more muscle mass, or you just want to eat healthier for your mental health. It's not, a ketogenic diet isn't where we start. I love the idea sometimes of having people experience ketones a bit. And I'm kind of curious some of your thoughts on, when people don't want to try a ketogenic diet, but they're curious about ketones. Do you say, low carb dinner, cream in your coffee, and see what happens? Or, is there something about, I don't want to do a ketogenic, but I'm keto curious,
Yeah, so I've done it. I've done multi-day fasts. The challenges, I think, for us as doctors, I don't want to make recommendations that may be harmful to people in terms of saying this is an absolute, you need to do this. I'm not one of those people beating the drum saying you need to go carnivore.
Are you not really similar in that way where it's like, look, there's exceptions to a lot of these things. There are people who are harmed by this stuff. You've got to acknowledge and be humble about that to be a physician.
I think that's true, and it's a little bit of a harder line to walk than it would be to just say, "Oh yes, absolutely, this is the fix for everything." With this said, coming back to a point I made before, so we have almost 90% of people who have at least some aspect of metabolic dysfunction. If we look at statistics around the world in terms of increasing rates of basically the 7 of the 10 most common diseases have at least some component of inflammatory metabolic dysfunction. In terms of what kills people around the world right now, when we look at disability, again, metabolic dysfunction is a principal driver of the most common conditions around the world. And I think there is this cloak that can be kind of cast upon all of us, which is to say, well, we don't quite know exactly what works for any individual, and therefore we should be cautious in making recommendations. And to that, I would say, I absolutely agree that for the average person, or really for almost anybody listening to this, unless you start making some changes to your lifestyle, specifically diet, exercise, sleep, stress mitigation, air quality, unless you start doing this, you have to accept that base rates are going to apply to you. And what I mean by that is if we look at how people are doing in the United States and around the world in terms of cognitive issues, in terms of mental health conditions, in terms of brain health conditions, these numbers are unprecedented and unsustainable. And I don't think there should be any debate around that. So it doesn't mean it is all preventable. It doesn't mean we can fix it all. But with 300 million or so people with depression, 300 million or so people with anxiety, with 57 million people around the world with dementia right now, rates that are going to go to 153 million by 2050, and about 16% of people age 50 or older experiencing mild cognitive impairment, which is the precursor to dementia. And knowing that if we don't do anything about it, these numbers will, at the very best case scenario, stabilize where they are, but probably will continue to go up. I don't accept that there's nothing that can be done, or that people should just assume that doing nothing is okay. And to that end, I would say, going back to the ketogenic piece here, I'm not making the blanket recommendation that people should go on keto, but I do think, absolutely think, that each of us, as it relates to diet, need to start making some changes. Some of them may feel a little bit drastic because the diet that people have become accustomed to is one that is so many standard deviations away from just a baseline, normal, healthy, whole food based diet, that starting to make some of these changes is essential. So, a keto diet is one variant of all the different diets that have been now looked at in terms of, do people receive benefits from these diets? And one of the most interesting pieces of this research is that when you compare a lot of these diets, so maybe a high fat, maybe a low carb, maybe a higher plant based diet, um, people tend to get significant benefits. But one of the major underlying contributing reasons is that they have stopped eating what most people are eating, which is arguably just poison. And by that, I mean, it is something that if you consume it, will kill you earlier than you would have otherwise survived, will decrease your quality of life, will contribute to conditions like depression and dementia. So, we can talk a little bit about kind of my take on what are the foods that I would recommend people eat more or less of. But the bottom line here is to say, it doesn't necessarily have to be a ketogenic diet, but you do need to get off the standard American diet, because that is making you sick. And that is absolutely, statistically speaking, over time, going to shorten your lifespan and decrease the quality of those years.
Oh, Austin, thanks for that. I love that. I hope everybody listening really hears that. You should hit rewind and listen to it again. Right? Listen to those stats. And I like Austin is saying it in a nice way, in a physicianly way, that it's coming for you. And not to be sensationalistic, I think, Austin, you try really hard out of all of us to be not sensationalistic. And I really appreciate that. And for all of your enthusiasm about ketones and brain energetics, to be really clear, for most people, the issue is not keto versus, extreme diet or this or that. That's really just a big waste of time. The issue, like the bugle that you're, calling or sounding, is that, there is something that is already taking away years of your life. There's something that's already contributing to depression and anxiety. That if you're not actively fighting against it, you're not doing everything you need to do for your health. It's really, I just turned in Healing the Modern Brain, and the book. We have the e-course up, but this is really where at the end I talk about a mental fitness revolution. Maybe I felt a little silly using that word revolution, right? But I really mean it, because just like you're talking about for our metabolic health and the mental health effects of that, the modern world has really presented a new set of challenges for our mental health, whether it's the screen or our sleep, or all of the effects of diet and lifestyle on our metabolism. And we're sitting here just watching rates go up, and we pay attention to the scary, awful ones like overdose and suicide, but we just look at rates of, people struggling with aspects of their mental health, their cognitive health, their quality of their emotional relationships, their feeling of loneliness. It is time for a revolution. It's going to get us. And we're not going to let that happen. So anyway, everyone, I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad you're listening to this conversation with Austin. Austin, I want to get into some things that I don't know a ton. I want to know more about. Everybody listening wants to know more about. I don't mean to shift us away from your food recommendations, but I like the nuance you ask us to appreciate those with. That it's just, you'll likely recommend a lot of the whole foods that we know and we've heard about, not because your food recommendations are general, but because we know what we should be moving towards. I'm wondering if you can help us understand some of the metrics, maybe some of the metrics you use at Big Bold Health to help us better understand this. There's a whole new kind of set of, let's say, lab values or ways that we can understand things like inflammation or our immune status. Some of them have penetrated conventional medicine, like ApoB or lipid profiles, which is really important. Everyone check, or a colonoscopy, right? Uh, Other ones, not so much. And I'm wondering if you can talk us through a little bit. If we're worried about our metabolic health, like what should we be thinking about in terms of metrics?
Yeah, well, so there's two areas here. One is immune activation, specifically inflammation. One is metabolic health, and the convenient thing here is there's a ton of overlap in these two domains. So, metabolic dysfunction promotes chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation promotes metabolic dysfunction, and some of the key pathways actually occur within those white adipocytes. So, specifically, white adipose tissue that tends to bring in immune cells, promote inflammation both locally and throughout the body, and vice versa. It will actually metabolic dysfunction promotes inflammation. Inflammation, as I said, promotes metabolic dysfunction. So these things are kind of tightly connected. Many people are familiar with the core metrics of metabolic dysfunction. In addition to those that are used to look at something called metabolic syndrome, there are a number of others that you could consider talking to your provider about, including a fasting insulin level. But as it relates to the immune system, which is really where we're spending our time at Big Bold Health, the core idea here is that if you were to look at how our bodies function, we tend to over-index towards understanding individual organs as opposed to what connects these organs. And as we've discussed in the context of metabolism, the immune system is located in and kind of guides the function of every organ within our body. So we have immune cells within our brain. They're called microglial cells. It's about 15% of the cells in our brain. We have immune cells in our skin, in our lungs, in our liver, certainly a ton of immune cells in our gut. And the relative programming of those immune cells has a lot to do with the relative state of health in our bodies. So, looking specifically as it relates to the brain and the immune brain connection, I had mentioned this before, but in the kind of immunity brain link, historically, we've looked at the body's immune system is separate from the brain's immune system. When we look at these microglial cells, we know they are receiving direct input from the body, including metabolic input, which ties things together. So, microglial cells are both programmed by metabolism and program our metabolic function. Um, when we think, however, about how do we actually measure or look at some of these metrics uh, in the brain, whether it's metabolism or immunity, specifically inflammation, it becomes a little bit challenging. So I'll break this down here a little bit. If we think about what's happening in the brain, historically we had to use a whole lot of proxies because up until very recently, only a few decades ago, we didn't have any sort of brain imaging scan. So the only way to actually know what was happening in the brain was to go into the brain and take a sample. So in the hospital, this is done pretty rarely, but certainly a lot more than in the clinic. But you'll do a brain biopsy to look for inflammation. And that might help us to differentiate the type of microorganism in a person's brain if they have an infection. It may help us to understand whether it's malignant versus inflammatory.
What part of my brain do you take in the biopsy? Is it the
That's
part? Because I
that's
got some
it.
stuff like eighth grade dance. Can you get that part?
Yeah, yeah, if we could selectively, side note here, Inside Out 2, great movie, but if we could selectively remove memories, that would be interesting. I don't think we're quite there yet. But just like you, I'm using hopefully most of my brain. I like the thing we learned when we were younger. You're only using 5% of your brain, and while it makes amazing movies, Lucy was pretty good with Scarlett Johansson. It's not the reality. We're using our whole brain, so we don't want to be taking out pieces of our brain to look for inflammation. So what
Yeah.
that means is we use other proxies, and it's the same with metabolism. We use imaging scans, and so a PET scan is one form of imaging scan, and along with an MRI that we can use to look for metabolic and immune activation within the brain. So there's a specific kind of protein called TSPO that can be looked for on imaging that gives us a sense as to whether there's this immune metabolic activation within the brain. Now, that's a whole lot of kind of seemingly esoteric information for the average
No,
person
that is
because
not esoteric at all. I just brought up Jeff Miller last episode, but I've been hearing about TSPO for a couple of years as the head of neuroimaging at Columbia has been looking at that and specifically tying it to symptoms like suicidal ideation in like this incredibly beautiful way with the science, exactly what you're talking about, where, and this is very new, everybody listening, right? This is like 8 years, 10. I mean, we just haven't been imaging brain inflammation or thinking in this way until really recently. So it's really very cool to hear this and to hear how your team and how you were trying to kind of help people actualize this data. I think we're also frustrated that, as the science is progressing super fast and as people are learning so much more, right, between Dr. Google, our colleague, and, just the ability of AI now to synthesize information for people, patients are more educated than ever, which is just great. But how we can get this technology and new information that works or that is of interest to certain individuals to them faster is just, it's a very cool new, say, wave of medical innovation that's happening.
well, let me speak to that for a second because when it comes to the actual metrics, the markers, many people are familiar with CRP, ESR,
C-reactive protein,
correct?
eosinophil sedimentation rate. These are med school quiz from Dr. Perlmutter here.
Yeah.
These are markers of inflammation. Like a ESR is basically like your blood. How fast it kind of um, comes out of solution in a way because of inflammatory factors. Is my understanding. C-reactive protein is like one of the a protein that gets activated in inflammation. There must be more new interesting markers between this and a TSPO neuroinflammation scan.
Yeah, well, that's actually where we're spending a lot of our time because we know that, for example, the immune system has thousands of cells and signals. You can measure many of these in the context of more detailed profiling of the immune system. This isn't necessarily something that I would recommend people do. If you get a basic blood sample, however, a CBC, a complete blood count, you will get information on things like white blood cells and subtypes of white blood cells, like neutrophils. So this does give us a signal. Usually, this is used again in the context of tracking something that was already suggested as an issue. So, in the hospital, you might measure these things to give us a sense as to is a person's infection getting better or worse. You can also track this in terms of what happens when people use steroids and the like. But the more nuanced levels of this are getting to deep profiling of cytokines, which are immune signals, as well as subtypes of immune cells. And we don't have to get into this in too much detail, but for example, the ratio of CD4, which is a type of T cell, CD4 cell to CD8 T cells tells us something about the relative state of the immune system. And One of the areas that we're most focused on is this idea that as we age, our immune systems age alongside us. The aging of the immune system predisposes us to developing a host of age-related dysfunctions.
This sounds like it's going to end badly, Austin.
It, well, that's the hope, is that it doesn't have to end badly,
Okay. Okay.
because aging itself, I don't think is a bad thing. It is an inevitable part of what it means to be alive.
Now, can I just say, don't you think in part that's because you've got such a superstar doc star dad? I mean, I don't know what your relationship's like with your dad. He seems he's a thoughtful, creative guy. And I think you're getting a really good version of aging with him. At least that's what it looks like. We can get back to you and your dad. I know I'm a psychiatrist. I'm sorry. I don't
I
mean to.
mean, we're gonna go there. Yeah. Okay.
We don't have to go there right now. I think you're getting a very good version of aging with your pops, is my hunch, who's also a very famous neurologist. And I do agree with you. I think it can be a really wonderful and great thing. My
Well, I
sense
guess
is
what I mean is that aging itself, going forward in years, shouldn't be looked at from my perspective as some sort of a negative. Now, I say that as somebody in their mid 30s, and maybe I will have a completely different perspective when I get into my later years. But the main point I would make is there is a healthy aging and then there is an unhealthy aging. And the version that most people will experience is a rapid and progressive drop off initially when they get diagnosed with issues, but then they will have kind of this slope over the last decades of their lives where, despite the fact that they are alive, the quality of their life is dramatically lower than it needs to be. And again, in terms of things that we should not accept, we should not accept the idea that when we get over age, let's say 50, that the quality of our body's function has to be very poor, and very focused here that our brain function, our brain's ability to enjoy life, to appreciate life, is going to drop off as kind of a unavoidable aspect of aging. Now, you probably have your thoughts on this, but there is this age-related cognitive decline, which is a term that has been popularized. We do know that obviously rates of dementia go up dramatically once we get over age 65. However, the assumption that I don't think we should make is that we inevitably will experience cognitive decline as we become older adults. Because the reality is that there are many people who are cognitively intact into their 90s and beyond. So it is not an inevitable part of what it means to age. And this gets us to the main point that I'm making here, which is aging in terms of the number of birthdays we have is inevitable. But what happens to our cells as we age, and especially our immune cells as we age, is something that we can intervene on. So this is going from what we would call chronological aging, which is our age in birthdays, to biological aging, which is the question of how well do our cells weather those years. And that's where something like diet really has a lot to say as to the quality of how our cells weather the years. So one person may be chronologically, meaning number of birthdays, 70 years old, but their cells could be 80 or their cells could be 65, depending on the test you look at, depending on how you measure these things. And what we're now learning is this biological age, which is cell aging, is a better predictor of anything that we should care about, meaning quality of life, mental health, cognitive health, functional abilities. So what I would say, and what I think the research and many amazing prominent experts are now telling us, is that we need to reshape our focus on aging away from this concern about the years marching on, and to ask the question, which I feel like is a psychological question: what is the quality of those years, not just in terms of how well we feel, how we enjoy those years, but how our cells do across that continuum of our lives? Because if we can start to ask how they're doing, and if we can start to slow the relative speed at which our cells age, we actually get to far more beneficial mechanisms of talking about aging than what we typically have, which is I'll wait until I have a birthday, I'll panic, I won't want to tell people how old I am. And while I don't want to get too far off topic here, we're seeing a massive rise in kind of what are very superficial, and I don't mean that psychologically, I mean that in terms of the location, interventions to make ourselves look younger, right? What can we do for our skin? What can we do for our hair? but we're not asking this question of what can we do for ourselves. And that's really getting to the root cause of what is driving aging. And so with Big Bold Health, we're looking at what we can do from the immune perspective to help reprogram cells towards a slower rate of aging. And I think that is emblematic of where the research will be going in terms of how nutrition influences our health. So we're looking specifically at polyphenols, which are nutrients found in certain plants or most plants, and whether they can influence the rate of cell aging by targeting pathways using complicated science called epigenetic modulation. So that I think is where the future of this is going. But the main point I would make for people here, and it's great conversation, especially as it relates to mental and cognitive health, is to reframe this conversation around aging away from saying, well, there are things that I can't control that I'm going to worry about, and rather towards things that are within my control that I can change. And that is looking at cell aging, biological aging, as opposed to chronological aging.
That's a great way to have us focused on really what's important. And I think all of us really appreciated in the big push with longevity, especially with Peter Attia's book Outlive, this real kind of fine. I think it's chapter 17. This real notion of focusing on emotional health, focusing on some of the challenges in healing the modern brain. I have a chapter about unburdening, about the effect of trauma, and that well, I know when you're talking about superficial kind of interventions, in some ways, things like cosmetics or maybe things that people try for a little bit and don't commit to that aren't as lasting as lifestyle. But I also think there's a way that when we don't, think about some of that deeper healing that needs to happen, we get caught up in maybe some of the metrics and we lose some of the quality that you're talking about of really having a very active and engaged and fit life, not just being physically strong and looking great. I have some thoughts on it. Also, so I'm 50 finally. And so, and so it's been, so you're in the middle of it. I had the first probably experience a few years ago where I really thought I was starting to just significantly lose a step. And then I realized my wife realized I needed reading glasses, but I still have the experience when I put on reading glasses, like I'm going to like win a Nobel Prize. I'm so bright because it's like so clear. And so some of those like inevitable pieces that you hear, they're kind of these milestones that you see your friends start to hit. It definitely gets you thinking about aging and health and how you're spending your time, when you start to think a decade from now and you realize you'll be 60, which is, wow, no matter how much you say the 50 is the new 30, 60 is that's a person who is very wise. And so it's I look forward to talking about aging with you and thinking about, especially for those of us, who are right in the midst of when it matters the most. Think about, men in their 40s and men and women in their 40s and 50s, but I guess I say men because they tend to avoid care a little bit more. And, all of the folks that really need help with their health and their metabolic health. And so I really appreciate this conversation and some of the, actionable steps, really in terms of like how we consider and conceptualize aging, how we consider and conceptualize kind of our engagement with things. Instead of thinking about the ketogenic diet, I bet everybody coming into this was thinking like keto versus not keto. And I love how you settle us down and really expand the conversation into considering how, as you said, the calculus really changes when you consider brain metabolism, as along with all the other things we know and think about the brain, this really a kind of unrecognized factor and all of the various ways that can be influenced. So it's just been a wonderful conversation, Austin. Everyone, Dr. Austin Perlmutter, he's got so much information on his podcast, his food is medicine company, Big Bold Health, is a wonderful kind of story to keep track of in terms of really trying to marry some of the latest science in terms of inflammation, the immune system, brain health, and cognition. Check out his books. We'll link to them in all of our show notes. Austin, I'm wondering if you can just leave us with a little bit. I ask everybody to leave a little piece of advice for us, or a little maybe nugget, or if we're gonna have you influence our mental health and mental fitness, which is my hope, which you really have. I love this conversation. You have a little like Austin Perlmutter prescription for us to in the next coming weeks? Are there a few things that you'd love to see all of us do to benefit our mental fitness and mental health?
Well, we didn't necessarily get to all the actionables, and that's impossible to do outside of a 10-hour course. But let me start by just saying, this is always appreciate conversations with you, Drew. I love how we're able to get to some meaningful stuff in the context of just talking about science. Um, if you've made it this far into our conversation, I really appreciate all of you out there listening and watching. And I hope that you will continue to be invested in the health of your brain because it really is the most important thing that you can invest in and that you own. A couple of things you could do right now, and then I want to kind of conclude by saying maybe an even more important thing, but the variables that have been shown time in and time again or time out to influence your brain state, specifically metabolic state, inflammatory state, that you can act on right now is one, prioritize 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep tonight. Very straightforward, probably the most powerful thing you can do to enhance your brain function right now. Now, I know it's easier said than done. There are lots of resources out there on my website. I'm sure, Drew, you have some great ones in terms of how do you improve quality of sleep, but sleep. Other things would be looking at the quality of what you basically consume throughout every aspect of your day. And we focused in this conversation on the role of nutrition. Nutrition is probably the most popular way that people think about what they consume. And certainly eating a diet that is low in processed food, that is high in whole foods is what I would recommend. I think that's what the research suggests is most beneficial as well. But looking at what you consume in terms of the food, important. Looking at what you consume in terms of what you breathe, also important. One of the best studied risk factors for worse brain function in terms of mental health and cognitive health outcomes is air pollution. We tend to be incredibly unaware of how much air pollution we're introducing inside of our homes, where we spend the majority of our time. So, paying attention to how much smoke, in particular, particulate matter, you're generating through cooking, through candles, through fireplaces, through other things. Huge understood, yeah, well understood but underutilized way to improve your brain function is to improve your air quality. Sedentary behavior, also huge. So moving your body. And then last thing I guess I'll just say on this front, we didn't get to in as much detail in this conversation, but I think substances are a really important part of this conversation too. So just looking at things that long term have been influenced or shown to influence better brain health. I think that there's a strange normalization of high rates of consumption of alcohol that, it's clearly shown to have negative outcomes when you get beyond that moderate level to mental health, to cognitive health. And I want to make sure to call that out because it is a very strange thing that we have normalized the consumption of this psychoactive drug that has very clear negative health outcomes associated with it when consumed at higher than moderate levels. So, a couple of the actionables there, lots more resources on my website. And again, I'm sure Drew has many on those things as well. In terms of one kind of closing point, something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is it's really interesting to talk about what you can do from kind of a lifestyle optimization perspective across all of these domains: eating healthier food, exercising more, getting better sleep. Um, but the fabric that ties it all together is the quality of connection to something more than just going through the motions. And so you can eat the best diet, you can exercise 2 hours a day, you can get perfect quality sleep, but it's not going to necessarily be the thing that makes your life all that meaningful. So I think the answer to what makes life meaningful for at least me, and I think what the research would show, is connection to something more than just ourselves. And that doesn't have to be religion, it doesn't even have to be spirituality. But I think that this is testament to why it's so important that we stay networked to something else. So that can be friends, family. For me, nature is a huge part of this. But that's kind of the glue that holds the whole thing together for me. So, if you're looking at longer term, what does the science tell us is most strongly correlated with good mental health? It's what we've seen from the Harvard study of adult development. It's connection. And so any way that you can foster that in a typical day, I think is an amazing way to prioritize what's happening in your brain.
I love those. I love those. That's such a great way to think about it, ranging from consumption. I love the shout out about alcohol. I'd even go a little farther, and I'd say there is no healthy level of consumption of alcohol. Although I think the social effects for some people that can be healthy, and maybe just occasionally having a little drink and dancing is probably great for you. Dancing's great for you. More people drink when they dance. I mean, So I can appreciate there's a role. But having stopped drinking a few years ago, it is pretty wild what happens to your brain. And I would say also, having been somebody who would occasionally take a little time off, what happened at, like, I would say 90 days, like 3 months, and then what happened at 6 months, the feeling. And then I remember the first time I went out and I felt euphoria when I was out without any alcohol. Just like, I was like, I don't know, is it out or something? I just felt remember I was at the APA, the American Psychiatric Association conference, about with all the shrinks, which is always a little strange. Great, but when you see like 100 psychoanalysts on the dance floor, it's hard not to think you're in a strange dream. But I remember I felt so, I don't know, just like happy, part of my community with all the drinks. And I'm laughing so hard. One of my friends was like, man, like, what did you take? You must be like super high. I was like, I just like nothing. I was just like, I'm breathing, I guess, the air of community. It was just a really, but it was something that didn't happen until much kind of later in that process. Um, and air filtration and the shout out about getting rid of your indoor candles. Amen, Austin.
And incense. Sorry to
Incense,
say it.
yeah. I mean, I love how you just speak the truth, man. Everybody loves the incense, but like, it's really not something you should ever have in your home, especially if you have kids. And I hate the scented candle because I love that whole, having the bath with the candle thing, or having the candle, little flicker of a flame. But really, it's where it makes a huge difference. Indoor air quality is just a really great recommendation. Since I spend almost, way too much of my time sedentary, because as a psychiatrist, you sit and listen a lot, and that's like a wonderful privilege. But I remember realizing, like, I got to put an air filter in this. I sit in New York all day long in a room. I can have really like HEPA clean air most of the time, or I could just be breathing unfiltered air. And so, find these little spots where you can make some of these shifts. Austin, thanks. I know you really love specific recommendations and evidence-based recommendations. So I appreciate you giving us some general encouragement and some different spheres of our life of how to really start taking great steps in our mental fitness and mental health. Everybody, thanks so much for being with us. There's another episode of the Dr. Drew Ramsey podcast. Please share, please take these lessons, whatever resonated with you, and do something amazing for your mental fitness with it. I can't wait to see you on the next episode. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Austin. Talk to you soon.
See you later.